The trouble began, as so many village troubles do, over a plate of seed cake and an argument about begonias. It was a clear, well-behaved June afternoon in Saimbo, town. Luke's Mead, the sort of day that looked as though it had been specially commissioned for the annual garden and produce show. The rectory lawns were strewn with white canvas marquees, trestle tables sagged under the weight of jams and jellies, and a faint, sticky perfume of strawberries and crushed. Grass hung in the warm air. Old Mr. Pottle's gramophone, placed on a rickety table under the copper beech, wheezed out a waltz that nobody quite listened to, but everyone would have missed if it stopped. Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, visiting her old school friend, Emmeline Harcourt, the vicar's sister, sat beneath a striped umbrella, her knitting needles flashing gently in the light. She appeared to be wholly absorbed in counting stitches. Only a faint tightening at the corner of her blue eyes suggested she missed very little. The women of St. Luke's Mead came and went before her like the characters in some well-thumbed novel, colorful, exaggerated, and entirely familiar. "I maintain," declared Mrs. Lydia Blount, planting a decisive finger on the tablecloth, "that begonias must be watered at the roots and never on the leaves. It is the only way to avoid mildew. My late husband always said." Her remark was cut off by a shrill, breathless cry. "Mr. Denholm! Mr. Denholm has fallen!" The cry came from the direction of the old mill house, which loomed beyond the rectory wall, its upper windows just visible between the elms. People turned as one. The clatter of teacups ceased. On the highest visible story of the mill house, the fourth floor, a narrow attic level that had long been the subject of village speculation, a casement window stood wide open, its tumbled curtains fluttering with a disquieting, frantic air, like hands waved in belated warning. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chairs scraped, a jam jar rolled and broke, and the well-ordered lines of St. Luke's Mead Society dissolved into a muddle of hurrying figures. "Good gracious," said Mrs. Harcourt faintly, dabbing at her lips with a napkin. "That must be from the mill-house garden. Emmett Denholm has been having that horrid scaffolding put up, you know, for his renovations. I told the rector it was tempting Providence. The fourth floor, indeed." "As if 3 were not enough in a village. Men in late middle age," murmured Miss Marple, rising more briskly than one would have thought possible, "are rather like boys of 12, in my experience. They will always climb a little higher than is wise." She did not hurry. In Miss Marple's view, haste rarely improved matters. Instead, she followed the streaming crowd at her own measured pace, patting her hat into place, her eyes taking in quickly, but quite without appearance of doing so, the various reactions around her. Pale faces, curious ones, a few unmistakably excited. Emmett Denholm was a newcomer to St. Luke's Mead, which of itself was enough to mark him for notice. Middle 50s, prosperous, hearty in manner, and loud in voice. He had bought the long-abandoned mill house 6 months before and set about modernizing it with a gusto that offended the aesthetic sensibilities of half the county. Stories about him had circulated almost from the moment his furniture van entered the village. That he had retired from something in finance, that he had left London abruptly, that there had been, here voices dropped significantly, trouble. Nobody could say exactly what kind of trouble, but villagers were unanimous that where there was smoke, there was usually a good, satisfying fire. By the time Miss Marple reached the narrow lane beside the rectory hedge, several of the younger men had already vaulted over the low stone wall separating the rector's garden from the mill-house grounds. A little crowd pressed itself against the gap in the hedge, craning for a better view. Somewhere a child was crying, the thin, uncomprehending wail jarring against the adult horror. "Oh, the poor man!" exclaimed Mrs. Blount, hand to her bosom. To fall from such a height. Why, no one could survive that. People made way, reluctantly but with genuine respect, for Superintendent Crispin Hale, who had been present at the show to judge the chutneys and had now acquired a graver, more official air. Hale was a big, square-shouldered man with an expression of habitual patience and eyes that had seen rather more of the world than most villagers supposed. He glanced briefly at Miss Marple as he passed her. There was the faintest of nods, as between colleagues who do not at all wish to be thought colleagues. "He fell from the fourth-floor window, they're saying," whispered Mrs. Harcourt to Miss Marple as they came up to the hedge. "You can see it from here, the one that's open." Miss Marple looked up. The mill house rose grey and self-important beyond the trees. On the fourth floor, directly above a patched strip of lawn where a figure lay unnaturally still, the small casement gaped. The ledge beneath it looked perilously narrow, scarcely wide enough for a flower pot. Yet the iron catch hung loose, and one curtain had snagged, so that its gauzy length streamed sideways, pointing downwards like an accusing finger. "My nephew says he heard a shout," a girl's voice put in eagerly. Jack was delivering lemonade for the refreshments, and he said there was a terrible sort of cry, and then a thud. "Didn't you, Jack?" Jack, a red-faced boy of perhaps 14, nodded importantly. "Like someone had the wind knocked out of him," he said. "Only louder." "Everyone back, please," called Hale from beyond the wall. "Back, if you please. There's nothing to be done here." The tone, more than the words, told them that it was true. The murmuring grew. Conjectures, like fledgling birds, fluttered uncertainly from one pair of lips to another. A ladder was fetched. The gate, which had been locked, was forced. Men came and went with that quiet, concentrated efficiency that is itself an admission of failure. Miss Marple, her lined face quite composed, glanced again at the distant open window. "A nasty accident," said Mrs. Harcourt shakily. "He must have been doing something quite foolish, clambering out to clean it, perhaps." "Very likely," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Though people who are afraid of falling," she added more to herself than to anyone in particular, "do not, as a rule, go very near open windows. It is so very human, you know." She turned away then, as if the matter were closed, and carefully retrieved her dropped ball of wool from the grass. No one noticed the brief, intent look she cast, not at the fourth-floor window this time, but at the faces around her. Startled, pale, intent, speculative, and one, just one, that was not so much shocked as calculating. The garden and produce show resumed after a fashion. The gramophone wound down without anyone bothering to wind it up again. Tea was drunk, but little seed cake was eaten. And in the midst of all the subdued flurry and well-bred agitation, Miss Marple went on with her knitting, her needles clicking as steadily as before, while somewhere at the back of her mind something had already, very quietly, failed to fit. For a few seconds after the fall there was a stunned, suspended silence, as though the afternoon itself had forgotten how to breathe. Then sound returned all at once. Shrieks, gasps, the clatter of a toppled tea tray, the harsh exclamations of men forcing themselves into action. "Stand back, please, stand back," cried Captain James Ashford, already striding toward the terrace with 2 other gentlemen in his wake. Miss Webb moved as if to follow, then paused, catching at the door-frame for support. Her lips formed soundless words before she whispered, "No, this can't." The rest dissolved in a faint, strangled sob. Miss Marple rose, quietly folding her knitting into her bag. She did not hurry. There is seldom any use in hurrying once the worst has occurred. As she made her way across the lawn with the other guests, she observed who pushed forward, who hung back, and who seized the moment to talk. Near the rose bed, Mrs. Bantry clutched at Mrs. Dane's arm. "My dear, did you see? Simply dreadful. Poor Gerald. I always said he was highly strung. I shouldn't be at all surprised if it were one of those nervous attacks." "But he fell," Mrs. Dane said slowly, her brow furrowing. "From the very top. One doesn't simply fall from a fourth-floor window without some reason." "People do the oddest things when distraught," Mrs. Bantry insisted, rather too readily. His finances, you know. And that business about the will? Well, of course one mustn't speculate. They were, in fact, already speculating at a considerable rate. By the time Miss Marple reached the terrace, Captain James and Dr. Haydock, summoned from among the guests by a breathless maid, were kneeling beside the motionless figure. It was quickly apparent that any professional assistance had come far too late. "Neck broken?" Dr. Haydock said curtly, his fingers at Gerald Ashford's wrist for form's sake. "Instantaneous, I should think." He turned sharply. "Where's the police? Someone telephoned the station at once." Miss Webb stood a little apart, her face rigid but oddly drained of expression, as though some inner mechanism had clicked into place. "I'll see to it," she said mechanically. "There's the study telephone." Captain James rose, his face unusually pale beneath its tan. "I shall go with you, Theo." His eyes flicked up to the offending window. "That damned floor. I told him it was unsafe. The sills are absurdly low. It must have been an accident." "It must." Miss Marple's gaze followed his, lingering on the white curtain, flapping softly at the open casement. She said nothing, but her mind filed away the captain's insistence with the same neatness with which she arranged her knitting wool. Within half an hour, Inspector Craddock had arrived from the nearest town, along with a uniformed constable who looked both eager and alarmed. The guests were shepherded back toward the lawn, murmuring indignantly or tearfully according to temperament, while the inspector examined the body with professional detachment. "Right," Craddock said at last, straightening. "No doubt about the fall. Question is, how and why?" His eyes moved over the assembled faces. "No one is to leave until I've taken your statements. I trust you'll all cooperate." "Oh, of course, Inspector," Mrs. Bantry said, stepping forward at once. "We're only too anxious to help. I was looking directly at the house when it happened. Well, almost directly, and I can tell you, I'll come to you in turn, madam," Craddock replied, with the patience of a man who had met Mrs. Bantry before. Miss Marple had taken a seat again, not far from the tea-table. She appeared absorbed in the process of retrieving a dropped ball of wool from beneath her chair. Those who noticed her at all saw only an elderly lady fussing with her knitting, a little paler than usual, but otherwise composed. In reality, she was turning over, with calm precision, the few facts already evident. Gerald Ashford had loathed heights. That much she had heard from Mrs. Bantry earlier in the summer, when discussing the Manor's peculiar upper floor. He had been a nervous man, timid, easily alarmed. Such a person did not lean casually out of a fourth-floor window. And yet he had gone through it. Accidents are so rarely accidental, Miss Marple reflected silently. At least not in villages. Inspector Slack, having satisfied himself that Gerald was quite beyond medical help, straightened with a sigh, and wiped his forehead with a large handkerchief. Haydock, grave and efficient, closed the dead man's eyes before rising. "He's been dead since the moment he hit the stones," the doctor said quietly. "Neck broken, most likely. There's nothing to be done." Slack cleared his throat importantly. "Well then, doctor, you'll examine the body proper in due course. For now, no one goes in or out of the house without my say-so." "Captain Ashford, if you please, I'll need to see that room upstairs." Captain James nodded, his jaw clenched. "Of course, Inspector. The fourth floor is locked. My cousin always kept the key on him." His gaze flicked involuntarily to Gerald's still figure. "Then we'll have to take it from him," Slack replied, briskly, though even he lowered his voice a little as he knelt to search the dead man's pockets. Miss Marple, who considered that the removal of objects from the clothing of the recently deceased ought always to be conducted with a certain discretion, looked away politely. Her attention drifted instead to the murmuring clusters of villagers scattered about the lawn. Already the machinery of village gossip was turning with remarkable speed and efficiency. "I always said Millbrook Manor brought bad luck, Mrs." Price Ridley was saying darkly to anyone who would listen. "Ever since old Mr. Ashford died up there all alone." Very unhealthy atmosphere, these big houses. Breed morbid thoughts. Hey, rubbish, snorted Colonel Melchett. Man probably slipped. Clumsy fellow Ashford, never had much sense. Mrs. Bantry, however, looked thoughtful. But it is odd, you know, she murmured to Miss Marple, having detached herself from Mrs. Dane with the practiced ease of one who had long experience of escaping dull conversation. Why on earth would Gerald be on the 4th floor in the middle of the Garden Society exhibition? And alone, too. Yes, Miss Marple agreed mildly, her needles moving. One does wonder about that, doesn't one? From the corner of her eye, she saw Miss Webb rise unsteadily to her feet. The secretary's face was pale, but there was a tightness about the mouth that suggested to Miss Marple not so much grief as intense concentration. I must, Miss Webb began, then seemed to think better of whatever she had been about to say. I should speak to Inspector Slack, she finished instead, smoothing her torn sleeve with a small, almost annoyed gesture. Miss Webb, Slack called as if summoned. You were the first to see the, fall, I understand. I'll want a full account. He turned to the assembled guests. The rest of you, please remain here. The constable will take names. No need for panic. This is likely a tragic misstep, that's all. That will not satisfy the village, Miss Marple observed softly. Mrs. Bantry gave her a sharp look. You don't think it was an accident, Jane? My dear Dolly, I never think anything of the sort until I have a little more information. Miss Marple smiled. I have found it so much safer over the years, not to think too quickly. A movement near the terrace caught her attention. Captain Ashford, having watched Gerald's body being borne respectfully into the house, now stood very still, one hand pressed against the stone balustrade. His eyes were fixed, not on the doorway through which the body had been carried, but upward, toward the 4th floor window, still gaping open like a dark, accusing mouth. He started visibly when he realized Miss Marple was observing him. For a moment their eyes met. Then he turned on his heel and followed Inspector Slack into the house with a swiftness that suggested escape rather than duty. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. Men who are used to command do not typically look as though the ground has shifted beneath their feet. Unless, of course, it actually has. What was that, Jane? Mrs. Bantry asked. Nothing at all, my dear, Miss Marple replied serenely. Merely thinking of a young man I once knew who found authority unexpectedly burdensome. Her gaze lifted again to the 4th floor window, and she noted, not for the first time, that it was the only one whose curtains did not stir with the breeze. By early evening, the orderly world of St. Mary Mead had dissolved into its favorite occupation, speculation. The shocking event at Millbrook Manor had spread through the village with the speed and precision of a well-practiced fire drill. At the Blue Boar, at the grocer's, at the post office. Mr. Gerald Ashford's fall from the 4th floor window had already become, in various retellings, a desperate suicide, a tragic accident, and in at least one version, narrated by Mrs. Price Ridley, a cunningly contrived murder. Miss Marple, having returned to her ivy-covered cottage, sat in her customary armchair by the window, her knitting in her lap, and a small oil lamp casting a warm glow on her lined, intelligent face. Outside, the summer evening settled gently over the village. A blackbird sang from the vicarage yew tree, and the faint sound of children's laughter drifted up from the lane. Dr. Haydock, having dropped in ostensibly to check on Miss Marple's rheumatism, sat opposite her, his long legs stretched out and his expression thoughtful. Well, Jane, he said at last, if I know you at all, you are not accepting Inspector Slack's tragic accident quite as readily as everyone else seems determined to do. Miss Marple smiled faintly. One must always be careful, Doctor, not to jump to conclusions. I have noticed that when people are eager to accept an explanation, it is often because it places the least strain on their nerves. Slack is certainly eager, Haydock admitted dryly. He's already muttering about overwork, debts, and nerves. Apparently the financial situation at Millbrook is rather dire. So I am told. Miss Marple said. "Mrs. Bantry was kind enough to enlighten me. Bailiffs, mortgages, unpaid tradesmen. That sort of strain does weigh on a man, particularly one of Ashford's temperament." "Exactly. A man in a desperate state, alone in an empty part of the house, an open window." He shrugged. "The coroner will likely return a verdict of suicide while of unsound mind. Slack will be pleased. No paperwork for a murderer." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "And yet, dear doctor, there remains the difficulty of Mr. Ashford's fear of heights, which you yourself have observed." Haydock frowned. "True enough. I've seen him go white as a sheet on a first-floor landing." He hesitated. "You think someone helped him out of that window?" "I think," Miss Marple replied mildly, "that something does not quite fit. There is the window itself, which was thought to be impossible to open. There is Miss Webb's torn sleeve with that little splinter of wood. And then there is Captain Ashford, who stands to inherit a very considerable property, albeit encumbered." Haydock snorted. "James Ashford may be many things, but a murderer?" He was genuinely shaken, Jane. "People can be quite genuine in their emotions," Miss Marple said gently. "I have known guilty persons to faint quite convincingly. One must look less at what people feel in the moment, and more at how they behave when they imagine no one is observing them." At that very moment, in the snug bar of the Blue Bull, Inspector Slack was expounding his views to an appreciative audience of one, the innkeeper, Mr. Potter. "Open and shut case, if you ask me," Slack said, puffing out his chest. "Debts up to his ears, quarrels with creditors, and that secretary of his hinting at dark moods. Fellow couldn't take it anymore. Climbed up to his uncle's old retreat and threw himself out." "Terrible shame," Mr. Potter said, polishing a glass. "And Captain James Utku, sir, they do say he's next in line for the manor." "Naturally," Slack replied. "But he's a respectable man, decorated officer. And he was down in the garden the whole time. Half the village saw him." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple folded her knitting with a small decisive movement. "It is often the little things, Dr. Haydock," she said thoughtfully. "An unused room that is suddenly used. A window thought impossible to open, which stands wide. A sleeve torn where one imagines it might catch on a stubborn sash. No, I do not think we have heard the last of the fourth-floor window." "Hidden treasures?" Inspector Slack repeated, his interest at last fully engaged. "What sort of treasures are we talking about, Mrs. Higgins?" The housekeeper shook her head sadly. "I couldn't say exactly, sir. But Mr. Harold, God rest him, used to have visitors, gentlemen from London, who came at odd hours and stayed very late. There were always locked boxes going in and out, and once I heard him say to the master, Mr. Gerald's father, that is, that the safest bank was a solid brick wall if you knew how to use it." Inspector Slack made a note of this with unnecessary vigor. "Smuggling, perhaps," he muttered, "or worse. Well, that puts a different complexion on things." Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window, appeared to be counting stitches, though in reality she was examining the housekeeper's face. There was no guile there, only genuine distress and an old-fashioned loyalty to the family. But something in Mrs. Higgins's earlier phrasing lingered in Miss Marple's mind. "You mentioned that Miss Webb asked about the old master's hiding places," she said gently. "Did she give any particular reason for her curiosity?" Mrs. Higgins hesitated. "She said it was for the sake of order, ma'am," said Mr. Gerald. "Wanted all his uncle's affairs put straight, to know where things were, to avoid unpleasant surprises. But it never sat right with me. She was too eager, always up those back stairs to the attic and the fourth floor when she thought no one was watching." "Yet you noticed," Miss Marple observed mildly. "A housekeeper sees more than she's given credit for," Mrs. Higgins replied with some dignity. Inspector Slack snapped his notebook shut. "This all suggests Miss Webb might have been hunting for something valuable. Papers, money, who knows? But that still doesn't prove Mr. Ashford's fall wasn't an accident." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment before resuming. "No, it doesn't prove it. But when one considers a man who feared heights, a window known to be jammed, and a room recently searched by someone eager to discover hidden valuables, well, it does make one think of certain parallels. Parallels? Dr. Haydock repeated, curious. In village disputes over wills and property, Miss Marple said, as if recalling some minor domestic incident. It is often surprising how, just before an expected inheritance, a locked drawer becomes curiously open, a document conveniently misplaced, or a relative inconveniently. She allowed the sentence to trail off with a faint, apologetic smile. Of course, human nature is much the same everywhere. That evening, back at her neat little house on the high street, Miss Marple sat by the fire with a fresh ball of pink wool. The shadows lengthened across the sitting room. The clock on the mantel ticked with reassuring regularity. To an unobservant eye, she might have appeared wholly absorbed in her knitting pattern, but her thoughts traveled methodically over every detail of the afternoon. The torn sleeve with its wood splinters, Miss Webb's too careful account, Captain James's quick pocketing of something from the desk, the open drawers in a room long neglected, the rumor of hidden valuables. It all formed a pattern, but not yet a complete one. There were voids where human motives should be. She thought of Miss Webb, competent, controlled, and yet with that flash of panic when the torn fabric was mentioned. A woman like that rarely allowed herself visible weakness. Panic suggested not grief, but fear of exposure. Then there was Captain James. Soldiers, Miss Marple knew, could be either ruthlessly straightforward or exceedingly adept at deception, depending on their temperament and experience. His protestations about debts and ruined inheritance had struck her as a trifle too emphatic, in the way of someone establishing a story in advance. The next morning brought rain, a steady, soaking that seemed to press the village closer in upon itself. Miss Marple walked to the grocer's with her basket, exchanging the usual pleasantries, listening more than she spoke. By the time she returned home, she had collected, as she knew she would, several useful fragments of village opinion from Mrs. Bartlett at the grocer's that Miss Webb was a lady who knew how to get what she wanted, and had once been engaged to an accountant who'd left rather suddenly after some irregularities. From young Tommy at the post office, that Captain James had received a wire the previous week, bearing a foreign stamp and causing him to swear softly before stuffing it into his pocket. From the vicar's wife, encountered under an umbrella, that Gerald Ashford had been anxious, terribly anxious, about a matter of conscience connected to his uncle's estate. Returning to her sitting room, Miss Marple set down her damp umbrella and folded her hands in her lap, letting the pattern settle. Something in the arrangement of these facts reminded her quite strongly of a certain matter in Little Ledbury 30 years before, when a timid clerk had nearly lost both his inheritance and his life over a misplaced codicil to a will. "If there is a will involved," she murmured, "or some document of equal importance, then whoever controls it may feel a very strong temptation indeed." It was at that precise moment that her doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. When she opened the door, umbrella still dripping in the porch, she found Miss Theodora Webb on her threshold, hat slightly askew, complexion pale, and eyes glittering with a curious mixture of determination and dread. "Miss Marple," the secretary said without preamble, "I must speak with you. I believe I am in very grave danger." The following morning dawned with a deceptive serenity over St. Mary Mead. Sunlight spilled politely over brick chimneys and tidy hedges, as if the world had not been upended on the previous afternoon's terrace. Yet in kitchens and parlors, over teapots and toast racks, Gerald Ashford's death was examined, dissected, and reassembled into a dozen conflicting narratives. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Cottle declared with authority that these nervous types always do for themselves in the end. At the grocer's, Miss Hart insisted it was financial ruin and disgrace, mark my words. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement wondered whether Theodore Webb had been too clever by half, and at the High Street post office, It was confidently agreed that Captain James's sudden good fortune was altogether too convenient for decency. Miss Marple, sitting by her parlor window with her customary early morning tea, heard much of this by the simple expedient of doing nothing at all. People, she had observed long ago, seldom spoke so freely as when they believed themselves merely passing on what everyone already knew. By 11 o'clock, Inspector Slack had called at the vicarage to inform the Reverend Clement that, pending the coroner's inquest, he was provisionally treating the matter as an accident with certain irregular features. This delicate phrasing reached Miss Marple's ears within the hour by way of the vicar's talkative housemaid, who considered it her Christian duty to share all important information with Miss Marple as promptly as possible. It was not Inspector Slack who knocked at Miss Marple's cottage door shortly after noon, however, but Captain James Ashford. He stood on the little brick path looking unexpectedly less sure of himself, hat in hand, his usually confident manner replaced by something more tentative. "Miss Marple," he began, when she had shown him into her neat sitting room. I hope I'm not intruding. Dr. Haydock suggested you might be a sensible person to talk to." Miss Marple's pale eyes twinkled faintly. "Dr. Haydock is very kind. Do sit down, Captain. I find people think more clearly with a cup of tea before them." Once supplied with tea and a slice of seed cake, Captain James seemed to gather his thoughts. "I don't believe Gerald's death was an accident," he said abruptly. "Nor do I believe he intended to take his own life. And yet Slack is content to let it pass as one or the other." "You have reasons, I take it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Beyond your cousin's unfortunate fear of heights?" James hesitated, then reached into his jacket, the same pocket Miss Marple remembered so clearly from the previous afternoon, and withdrew a folded sheet of notepaper, creased and slightly grubby from much handling. "I found this in Uncle Harold's desk, on the 4th floor," he said. "It had been pushed to the back of a drawer. I didn't show it to Slack. I wasn't sure I ought to." Miss Marple took the letter with unobtrusive care. The paper was of good quality, the ink slightly faded. The writing, firm and decisive, belonged unmistakably to the late Harold Ashford. "My dear Gerald," she read aloud, her voice low and even. "If you're reading this, it means I have failed to resolve a matter that should never have been left in doubt. You will hear many plausible stories from plausible people, but remember this: what is hidden in this house is not merely of monetary value. It is proof. And proof is a dangerous commodity for those who have built their lives upon lies. Be very careful whom you trust, particularly among those who serve you." She folded the letter thoughtfully. "Very curious, and dated 2 months before your uncle's death. Gerald told me once," James said slowly, "that Harold was obsessed with the 4th floor window. He said it like a joke, but there was something strained about it. I thought it was just another of his eccentricities." Miss Marple looked up quickly. "The 4th floor window. He said that particularly?" "Yes. Everything comes back to that wretched window," he said. I assumed he meant the view. "People rarely mean only what they say," Miss Marple observed, "especially habitual concealers." James studied her face. "You think the letter has something to do with Gerald's death?" "I think," she replied gently, "that 2 men in succession preoccupied with the same window, and both now deceased, is a coincidence I am quite unable to accept." Outside, a church bell began to chime the hour, its measured notes underscoring the steady progression of events. Somewhere between Harold's mysterious warning, Gerald's declared intention to end a deception, and a fall from a window that could not easily be opened, Miss Marple felt certain the true beginning of the crime lay waiting to be uncovered. The news of Miss Webb's flight traveled to St. Mary Mead with the swiftness of something long anticipated. By the following morning, the village was alive with cheerful horror. At the grocer's, Mr. Tompkins declared it was always the quiet ones, while at the post office Miss Whittaker opined that a woman with a sharp nose and sensible shoes was bound to come to a bad end. At the Blue Boar over luncheon, two commercial travelers agreed that these educated lady crooks were the worst kind. Miss Marple, however, sat in her usual chair by the window at the vicarage tea that afternoon, her knitting resting in a pale pink cloud on her lap, her eyes thoughtful. Griselda, the vicar's lively young wife, fluttered about with cups and plates in an agitation that was only partly affected. "Jane, you must admit it is frightfully dramatic," Griselda insisted, handing her a plate of seed cake. A secretary with a false name, a criminal past, hidden safes, and then a daring escape by bedsheet. It's practically shouting, "I did it!" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, life very seldom shouts. It usually murmurs indistinctly, and one must listen very carefully. I am not at all sure that Miss Webb's escape tells us what we think it does." The vicar, stirring his tea with painful concentration, looked up. "But surely, Miss Marple, an innocent person would remain to clear her name." "Not invariably, Leonard. Innocent people have a most unfortunate habit of panicking when confronted with the law, particularly if they have once been found guilty of something else. I recall poor Emily Burrows, quite the gentlest soul, who ran away simply because she feared being accused of poisoning her aunt's cat. In the end, the cat had choked on a button." Griselda laughed. "But in this case, Jane, we have more than a dead cat." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "We have a dead man who appears to have been determined to reveal a deception, and a woman with every reason to fear that revelation. That is quite enough to make her run, whether she pushed him from that window or not." Later that evening, back at Millbrook Manor, Inspector Slack fussed over maps and constables as they organized a search for the fugitive secretary. Captain James, looking worn and irritable, poured himself a stiff drink in the study. Miss Marple, perched unobtrusively near the window, watched him with mild attention. "You're remarkably calm, Captain," she observed. "Most men who have just unexpectedly inherited a heavily encumbered estate and a scandal would be either exultant or despondent. You are neither." James managed a wry smile. "Truthfully, Miss Marple, I'm overwhelmed. The debts are monstrous, and now there's talk of murder in every sitting room from here to the High Street. Hardly the inheritance one dreams of." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet you remain. That suggests either duty, or that there is something here you value very much indeed." His eyes flickered toward the ceiling, toward that troublesome fourth floor, before he caught himself. It was the tiniest of movements, but Miss Marple noticed. "Tell me," she went on gently, "did your uncle ever speak to you of this proof he mentions in his letter? The dangerous thing hidden where thieves would never think to look?" James hesitated a second too long. "Nothing specific, only that there were family matters best left undisturbed." "Family matters," Miss Marple repeated. "So not merely financial. How very interesting." At that moment, Mrs. Higgins appeared in the doorway, twisting her hands. "Begging your pardon, sir, but I've just had a word from Thomas the gardener. He was up by the boundary wall near the old folly at dawn. Says he saw someone out there in the half-light, digging. Thought it was poachers at first, but now, with what's happened, digging." James straightened sharply. "What on earth for?" Mrs. Higgins swallowed. "Says they were near the spot where old Mr. Harold used to walk of an evening. The very place he always stopped to stare up at that fourth-floor window, like it was watching him back." Miss Marple's fingers stilled on her knitting. Someone, it seemed, was not looking for escape at all, but for something long buried, and perhaps far more dangerous than anyone yet realized. They found Theodora Webb seated on an overturned crate in the potting shed, her back straight despite the damp chill, hands folded neatly in her lap, as though awaiting a delayed appointment rather than arrest. A constable stood guard at the door, looking somewhat sheepish. The fugitive had offered no resistance at all. Inspector Slack entered with evident satisfaction. "Well, Miss Webb, or should I say Miss Hartley, your little excursion is over. Running away never did an innocent woman any favors." Theodora looked up with eyes that seemed older than her carefully maintained features. "I wasn't running from innocence, Inspector," she replied quietly. "I was running from inevitability. There's a difference." Miss Marple, who had accompanied Captain James to the scene, observed the exchange with her customary quiet attention. The potting shed smelled of earth and old fertilizer, with gardening tools hanging in orderly rows along the walls. It struck her as precisely the sort of place where practical secrets might be hidden, though at present it housed only one very inconvenient one. "Miss Webb," Miss Marple said gently, stepping forward. "I wonder if I might trouble you with a few questions before Inspector Slack conducts his more formal interview. I am an old woman, you see, and I find uncertainty very trying to the nerves." Theodora's mouth twitched in what might have been the echo of a smile. "You don't strike me as easily troubled, Miss Marple. But yes, ask what you like. I suspect you understand more of this than most." Inspector Slack opened his mouth to object, but closed it again, perhaps recalling previous occasions when Miss Marple's gentle inquiries had yielded more than his direct interrogations. "You came here under false pretenses," Miss Marple began mildly. "You concealed your name and your past, yet you remained for 2 years without taking open action. Why?" "Because I had nothing but suspicion," Theodora replied wearily. "My father died a ruined, broken man, muttering about Harold Ashford and a promise betrayed. The inquest called it an accident. He fell from scaffolding on an Ashford property. But he never stopped saying that Harold deliberately removed the safety rail. I needed proof, not just a story from a man half maddened by pain and laudanum." "And you believe that proof might be hidden in this house?" Miss Marple prompted. Theodora nodded. "Harold was vain. He'd want to justify himself on paper, explain why he had been forced to such an act. Men like him always do. When I learned Gerald had inherited, I saw my chance. A discreet, capable secretary with excellent references is rarely questioned. I searched slowly, carefully, but I never found what I needed. Until recently," Miss Marple suggested. "Your interest in the 4th floor, the drawers disturbed. I thought I'd finally discovered the key," Theodora admitted. "Harold's journals mentioned my watchtower, a room from which he saw everything. I was certain that meant the top floor. And then last week, I found a draft of a letter from Gerald to a solicitor in London, asking about the legal implications of exposing an old murder that would destroy a family. Name. After that, I knew he'd found something." Inspector Slack interrupted impatiently. "All very dramatic, madam, but it doesn't explain why Gerald ended up going out that window while you were up there with splinters from the sill in your sleeve." Theodora's self-control faltered for the first time. "Because he called me there," she said harshly. "He sent a note through Mrs. Higgins asking me to meet him on the 4th floor at 4 o'clock. He said, 'It's time we discussed your father's death like civilized people.'" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "You admit you were there, then?" "Of course I was there," Theodora replied, almost angrily. "Do you think I would have missed the moment I'd waited half my life for? When I arrived, the window was already open. Gerald was pacing like a trapped animal. He said he'd found my uncle's confession, that it confirmed everything my father had said. But he wouldn't give it to me. He said he needed to speak with James first, that the family must decide how much truth the world could bear. And then," Miss Marple's voice was very soft now, "we argued," Theodora said bleakly. "I wanted the paper. He refused. He stood by the window holding it and said if he gave it to me, the Ashford name would be finished. I told him justice mattered more than names. He said justice was for the living, and my father was long dead." She paused, swallowing hard. At some point, I grabbed his arm. He pulled away sharply, too sharply. His heel caught the edge of the carpet, and he stumbled backwards into the sill. I reached for him, but... Her voice broke. "I didn't push him. I swear to you, I didn't push him." Inspector Slack snorted. "A very pretty story, considering your history." Miss Marple did not respond immediately. She was remembering the drag marks on the floor, the gouges in the sill. But not the clean imprint of a single fall, but the messy evidence of a desperate scramble. "Tell me, my dear," she asked quietly, "when you left that room, because you did leave it very quickly, I imagine, was Gerald still holding the confession?" Theodora stared at her, then slowly shook her head. No, he wasn't. When he fell, his hands were empty. And the confession itself?" Miss Marple continued, though she knew the answer already. "That was nowhere to be seen when we searched." "No," Theodora whispered. "Someone took it. Someone who came after." The implications of that simple statement settled heavily in the earth-scented air. If Theodora Webb had not left the fourth-floor room with the confession, then someone else had gone there after Gerald's fall, someone with both opportunity and a powerful motive, to ensure that Harold Ashford's written admission of murder never saw the light of day. The inquest was held in the village hall 3 days later, under a sky the color of pewter. News of Captain James Ashford's arrest had traveled well beyond St. Mary Mead, and the little building was crowded with curious faces, all eager to hear how a garden party had ended in death and disgrace. Miss Marple sat quietly near the back, her hands folded over her handbag. The knitting had been left at home. There were times, she felt, when wool and steel might distract one from matters that deserved a person's undivided attention. Theodora Webb gave her evidence with an economy of words that impressed the coroner. She did not attempt to excuse her past crimes, nor to embellish her account of Harold Ashford's betrayal of her father. She merely stated, in a level voice, that she had come to Millbrook Manor for truth, not for money. Captain James, pale but controlled, confirmed his earlier statement. He admitted to burning Harold's confession in a moment of panic, to spare the family a scandal that would help no one, and to struggling with Gerald by the fourth-floor window. He insisted, however, that his cousin's death had been the result of accident, not intention. Inspector Slack, somewhat chastened by the collapse of his tidy theory, nevertheless presented the case with blunt fairness. His evidence concerning the window frame, the splinters, the drag marks on the dusty floor, and the altered desk drawers painted a picture of desperate men struggling over a piece of paper that had the power to ruin reputations and remake lives. When Miss Marple was called, she rose with the unhurried grace of a woman long accustomed to church aisles and village meetings. Her testimony was delivered without drama, yet each small observation, the supposedly swollen window sash, the torn sleeve, the mirror, and its hidden compartment, the black smoke from the gardener's incinerator, formed together a chain no jury could easily ignore. "One learns a good deal by living in a village for so many years," she concluded gently. "People repeat themselves, you know. A lie always seems to require more embroidery than the plain truth." In the end, the coroner's jury returned a verdict of manslaughter while resisting lawful disclosure, a phrase that satisfied neither those who longed for full condemnation nor those who pitied Captain James. Theodora Webb was formally exonerated of any part in Gerald's death, though her past remained an awkward shadow at the edge of respectability. Outside the hall, people dispersed in low-voiced clusters, already turning the tragedy into anecdote. Miss Marple, stepping out into the cold, still air, paused for a moment on the worn stone steps. In her mind's eye, she saw again the open fourth-floor window, the dragged footprints in the dust, the desperate clutch at a torn jacket sleeve. Not merely the mechanics of a fall, but the long chain of choices, selfish and sacrificial, that had led to that instant. Human beings, she reflected, seldom fell by accident alone. The library slowly emptied after Captain James's halting confession, leaving only a small knot of people. Inspector Slack, pale with the realization that his obvious suspect had not been so obvious after all. Haydock, watching quietly, Theodora, still seated, hands clenched tightly in her lap, and Miss Marple, who had resumed her knitting but not yet a single stitch. Inspector Slack cleared his throat with unnecessary force. "For the record," he said, clearly trying to recover some sense of authority, "you are admitting that you struggled with your cousin over a document, that he fell from the window during that struggle, and that you subsequently destroyed that document in the incinerator. James's shoulders sagged. Yes, sir. I never meant to kill him. I burned the confession because it was the only way to prevent the scandal from dragging the entire family through the mud for a crime committed a quarter of a century ago. And then, Miss Marple added gently, you were content to let suspicion fall upon Miss Webb, whose past you very quickly investigated, and whose character you described in terms that were, shall we say, convenient. James looked at Theodora with something like shame. I told myself it was justice. Your father was no saint. He benefited from Harold's crimes. I thought, you thought that because my father once trusted your uncle, he deserved to die. Theodora's voice shook, but there was iron in it. You thought that because I have a criminal record, I deserved to be hounded as a murderess. Miss Webb, Miss Marple said softly, vengeance has a way of breeding more tragedy than it ever mends. Your father sought justice and was silenced. Gerald tried, in his fumbling way, to do right and died for it. Captain James tried to save a reputation and nearly condemned an innocent woman to the gallows. One must decide where the cycle ends. Theodora's eyes glistened, but she lowered her gaze. Will anyone now believe what Harold Ashford did? Harold's confession is gone, James muttered. There is no proof. Only my word, and I doubt that will carry much weight at present. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him for a moment with a curious mildness. Oh, I shouldn't be too certain of that, Captain. People tend to believe those who admit to something against their own interest. And you have now placed Harold's guilt on the record in front of witnesses. The inquest will wish to hear it. So, I imagine, will Mr. Marsh, that rather tenacious solicitor who I happen to know, kept a copy of Harold's original letter in his files. Lawyers are oddly sentimental about incriminating documents. Inspector Slack started. Copy? Why wasn't I told? Because you never asked, Miss Marple replied, almost apologetically. You were quite busy arranging Miss Webb's guilt. It seemed kinder to wait until you were ready to hear more complicated truths. Slack opened his mouth, then shut it again, recognizing perhaps the justice of this. Dr. Ossoir, Haydock gave a short, dry chuckle. You played a dangerous game, Miss Marple, the doctor remarked. That business with the hedge and the incinerator, if James hadn't risen to the bait. Oh, but he would, said Miss Marple serenely. Men of his type, proud, honorable in their own fashion, cannot bear to think of themselves as cowards. Once he realized someone had seen him burn the papers, he had only two choices. Lie brazenly and badly, or tell the truth and cling to the distinction between accident and murder. Most people, when given the chance to confess to the lesser sin in order to avoid the greater, will do precisely that. For the first time, Theodora looked directly at Miss Marple, a question in her eyes. And what am I to do now, Miss Marple? I came here to prove a murder. All I have to show for it is another dead man, and a confession burned to ash. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. You have something far more valuable, my dear. You have the truth publicly spoken. It will not bring your father back, but it will clear his name in the only court that truly matters in the end. Human memory. As for yourself, well, you might consider that you have been given an unexpected chance. It would be a pity to waste it on becoming like the men who wronged you. Theodora Hartley, no longer Miss Webb, no longer simply a convicted fraudster, closed her eyes briefly, as if letting go of something very heavy. Perhaps, she said at last, that is the closest thing to justice I am going to get. Miss Marple nodded, her needles finally resuming their quiet, steady click. In this world, my dear, it very often is. It was some weeks later, on a mild September afternoon, that Miss Marple sat beneath the laburnum in her little garden, her knitting basket at her feet and a letter from Dr. Haydock folded neatly beside her tea-cup. The case of the fourth-floor window, as the village had taken to calling it, had officially concluded. Captain James had been committed for trial on a charge of manslaughter rather than murder. The coroner's inquest, aided by Dr. Poor, Haydock's evidence of torn cloth on the windowsill and the absence of any bruising consistent with deliberate pushing had accepted that Gerald's fall had followed a struggle, rather than a calculated act. James's own confession, once begun, had continued with weary completeness. The burning of Harold's sealed statement, the attempt to persuade Gerald to be sensible, the final, panicked grab that had torn cloth instead of saving a life. Theodora Hartley, had been exonerated of any part in Gerald Dowell's death. Inspector Slack, though reluctant, had been forced to acknowledge that her lies concerned her past, not the crime. She walked since left St. Mary Mead, her departure as quiet as her arrival had once been. Only Miss Marple knew that Dr. Haydock had pressed an envelope into her hand at the station. A modest sum collected, as he put it, from those of us who think justice sometimes needs practical assistance. Griselda came through the garden gate with her usual brisk energy, brushing a fallen leaf from her coat. "Jane, I've just come from the vicarage. Leonard has been wrestling all morning with his sermon on forgiveness, and I must say your wretched window case has made it frightfully complicated for him." Miss Marple smiled. "Moral questions are always complicated, my dear. Crimes are rather simple by comparison." Griselda sat, eyeing her with affectionate suspicion. "He says he can't decide which needs more forgiveness. Harold for his old murder, James for his panic and cowardice, or Theodora for her quiet determination to see everything dragged into the light. Leonard says motive matters, but consequences matter too." Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. "Motive always matters, but not in the way people suppose. It tells you who might do a thing, not whether they did. Poor Harold killed from fear of ruin, James from fear of disgrace, and Theodora risked quite a lot merely to have the truth named. All very human in their different ways." Griselda regarded her shrewdly. "You knew about James before he confessed, didn't you?" "I suspected," Miss Marple corrected mildly. "The difficulty lay in giving him the opportunity to convict himself. Men like Captain James seldom respond to direct accusation. They must trip over their own certainties. That little remark about the hedge and the incinerator smoke was a complete invention," Griselda finished, half scandalized and half delighted. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Pure fancy, my dear, but a very old trick. People who feel safe always rush to improve a story. His anxiety to deny what I had not actually seen told me far more than any footprint could have done." "And poor Gerald," Griselda said softly. "Do you truly think he meant to do the right thing?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that he tried, but he hesitated, as weak people do. He wanted both virtue and safety, and life rarely allows one both. By the time he had resolved to act, James had also decided, quite unwisely, that he must prevent him. The fourth-floor window simply provided the stage upon which their resolutions collided. A robin hopped nearer, hopeful for crumbs. Miss Marple dropped a few with absent precision. "You see, Griselda," she added, "in every village there are windows one does not care to look through. Old scandals, ruined reputations, things locked away. Yet sooner or later, someone opens them, and then everyone cries out at the draft. The Ashfords had their window. The Webbs had theirs. It merely took 25 years for the sashes to give way." Griselda was silent for a moment. "And you, Jane, do you never grow tired of looking through such windows?" Miss Marple's smile was faint and rather sad. "Oh, my dear, one doesn't choose the habit of seeing. One simply has it. Besides, if you've watched village life as long as I have, you know that very little is new. Captain James was only a stronger version of young Tommy Bond, who tried to hide his brother's mischief and ended by making it worse. Theodora was a more determined Miss Hart, who insisted on having the last word over a borrowed teapot. Human nature repeats itself, merely changing costumes. From the lane came the distant sound of and Mrs. Bantry's unmistakable voice hailing a passer-by with some fresh piece of news life instituted. Mary Mead had resumed its familiar rhythm. Chrysanthemums and church fetes and quiet suppers, all with the comfortable illusion that violence and tragedy were things belonging to other places. Miss Marple picked up Dr. Haydock's letter again, her eyes lingering on his closing lines. You were right, as usual. No fingerprints, no revolvers, only people. She folded it with precise care and slipped it back into its envelope, then returned to her knitting, the small, neat rows marching steadily forward. Yes, she said at last, half to herself and half to the late roses glowing against the garden wall. Only people, and they are quite dangerous enough. The sale of Millbrook Manor, when it finally came, was conducted with considerably less excitement than Mrs. Bantry had anticipated. The London agents spoke gravely of structural concerns and unfortunate history, but there was still a certain type of purchaser for whom such things posed no barrier. Indeed, who found them rather attractive. Miss Marple learned all this one crisp morning over buttered toast at the vicarage as Griselda breezed in with the latest report. An architect and his wife are from town, she announced, depositing herself on the nearest chair. Very modern, apparently. They talk of reclaiming the house, turning Millbrook into something called a retreat center. The world is very fond of retreats, Miss Marple observed mildly. From work, from noise, from one's relatives, though, alas, not so easily from one's conscience. Leonard, behind his newspaper, gave a faint cough that might have been amusement. Some days later, the first signs of change appeared along the lane. Scaffolding went up around the manor. Men clambered like purposeful ants along the roofline, and work began on dismantling the incongruous fourth-floor addition. From the vicarage garden, Miss Marple could see the outline growing cleaner, the old Georgian lines emerging once more beneath the scars of later concealment. Rather symbolic, don't you think? Dr. Haydock remarked, pausing by her gate one afternoon. Slice off the excrescence, and the house is restored to decency. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Houses can be restored, Doctor. People must manage with their history a little longer. He studied her shrewdly. You're still thinking about James Ashford. The man's fortunate not to be in the dock alongside Mrs. Dane. Fortunate, yes, Miss Marple agreed, but not, I think, unmarked. There are punishments other than those handed down by a judge. He chose to burn the confession, to protect his family name rather than the truth. That choice will stay with him. And Miss Webb? He asked. Our terrible criminal from the newspapers? Miss Marple's gaze drifted past the hedges, as if she could still see the silhouette of the fourth-floor window. I fancy Miss Webb may do rather well. She has intelligence, persistence, and a cause now publicly vindicated. The law can be harsh on those who trespass against property, but it is oddly gentle with those who trespass in pursuit of justice that has been too long denied. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. You astonish me sometimes, Jane. You speak of justice as though it were something distinct from law. But of course it is, Miss Marple said, as if explaining something obvious to a child. Law is what men agree upon for the sake of convenience. Justice is something older and far more troublesome. It insists upon being paid, whether accounts are formally drawn up or not. He left her then, and the days slipped quietly forward. Newspapers carried small notices, the committal of Mrs. Eleanor. Dane for trial, the forthcoming sale of certain Ashford heirlooms. A brief paragraph on the posthumous clearing of Edward Webb's reputation in connection with financial law. Irregularities long past. In the village, people spoke of other things. The weather, the price of coal, the scandal of Mrs. Price Ridley's niece eloping with an insurance clerk. Yet, as so often happens, the essence of the story had already been absorbed into the quiet, moral imagination of St. Mary Mead. Children were warned not to pry into other people's secrets, lest you come to a bad end like those at the manor. Young couples walking up Church Lane lowered their voices as they passed the now altered house. And in drawing rooms over tea it became accepted wisdom that nothing good ever came of old family secrets. Miss Marple, sitting by her window one twilight, allowed herself a small private conclusion. 3 families, she reflected, bound to one house and to one man's sin. Harold Ashford's original crime, the murder of Edward Webb, had not been erased by time, secrecy, or even confession, slipped guiltily behind a mirror. It had simply waited, like dust in unused rooms, until disturbed. Then, in disturbing it, the living had revealed themselves as clearly as the dead. There had been greed in Mrs. Dane, but also genuine injury. There had been weakness in James, but also loyalty of a sort. There had been stubborn courage in Theodora Webb, and in poor Gerald, that fatal wavering impulse toward what was right, undertaken too late. It was, Miss Marple thought, very much as in the Bible, unto the 3rd and 4th generation, not a supernatural curse, but the plain, observable way of human nature. Wrongs, if unacknowledged, did not simply vanish. They propagated themselves through frightened decisions and selfish evasions, until some crisis forced the reckoning. From the lane, the newly simplified facade of Millbrook Manor could now be seen clearly, its line clean against the evening sky. No 4th floor, no accusing window. Yet Miss Marple, with her lifetime of observation, knew that the absence of a window did not signify the absence of what it had once framed. Places forgot more easily than people, and people in turn forgot more easily than the slow, implacable memory of their own actions. She picked up her knitting again, the soft click of needles merging with the quiet of the village settling to sleep. Mystery, after all, was only another name for the parts of human behavior that people preferred not to examine too closely. And in St. Mary Mead, as everywhere, there would always be more of it, ripening quietly behind lace curtains and privet hedges, until someone, somewhere, chose to look as steadily as Jane Marple did at the simple, troubling truth. She set another neat row of stitches and smiled faintly into the dusk. The 4th floor window was gone, but what it had revealed would not be so easily dismantled.